Referring to the rumors of the Mormon disturbances, one can go into the street at any hour and find a cloud of witnesses who cross the plains via Salt Lake, ready to testify that they have been despoiled of their goods. In point of strength, the Mormon community is respectable, but by no means terrible. As in all cases of popular delusion, the real culprits are comparatively few, and after they are disposed of, forbearance may well be shown to the rank and file. It is indispensable that Brigham Young, and such of his coadjutors against whom overt acts can be proved, should be tried and executed. Lieutenant Gunnison, with a train of 18 wagons, came up the Arkansas River, crossed the Rocky and Wasatch Mountains into the Beaver Valley of the Salt Lake region. Arrived here, Lieutenant Gunnison with 11 men left the camp for the purpose of exploring the country about Sevier Lake. On the 26th of October, they were attacked by a branch of the Utahs called the Povans, a band of murdering thieves well known by the immigrants, and all the party killed. Some days later, the Indians sent a messenger saying that the attack was made in revenge for the recent defeat of the tribe at Cedar Springs by the Hildreth's party, in which 11 Indians were killed and several wounded. Brigham Young delivered an elaborate address to the saints upon the Indian difficulties. He ordered every settler to make his dwelling like a fort so that he can kill 10 where he can now only kill 1. In reply to the question frequently asked him of what he intended to do with Walker, the Utah chief, he says, "I do not want his head, but I wish him to do all the devil wants him to do, so far as the Lord will suffer him, and the devil to chastise the people for their good. I say to the Indians, as I have often said to the mob, go your length. You say, you are going to kill us all off? You say you are going to obliterate the Latter-day Saints and wipe them from the earth? Why don't you do it, you poor, miserable curses?" Brother Brigham then argued that the strength of the Indians has been greatly reduced. Some of the little tribes in the southern part of the territory have not a single squaw amongst them, for they have traded them off for horses, etc., and this practice will soon make the race extinct. Elder James McKnight writes from Utah in explanation and justification of the brutalizing practice of polygamy among the saints. Our young ladies, accomplished and beautiful, often choose a man with 10 or 20 or 40 wives in preference to an attractive youth who has not one, thus showing their proper taste and regard for age and experience. If one of your most polite, fashionable, fascinating young gentlemen should come here, he would find it very difficult to get a wife. And if he succeeded at all, would in all probability be one whom our gray-headed and infirm old men would refuse. I met a prominent citizen of Salt Lake City, who I believe one of the 12 apostles. I heard him say that when Utah applied for admission into the Union, she would seek to be enrolled as a slave state. He said that he owned a slave, that all the apostles did, and that polygamous Brigham Young owned several Negroes. This statement, although at variance with previous accounts from Utah, is undoubtedly true. I submit it as a text for political essays. A remarkable celebration was held at the headwaters of the Big Cottonwood. After an opening prayer, Brigham Young remarked, "I have enjoyed this day because of the liberty each of us has enjoyed." We have celebrated the 24th of July ever since we came into the valleys and the mountains. I could say a great deal on this occasion, the 9th anniversary of our emancipation from the yoke of bondage, but I shall wait with patience, in anticipation of the day when the people of God will triumph over the wiles and powers of Satan and assume their place among the nations of the earth. But let me tell you that this will never be until this people are a holy people. They have got to be sanctified, no matter whether they are many or few. When their time comes, they will go forth and maintain their rights, conquering and to conquer until Satan is bound. Brigham Young again boasts of his prowess in holding fast to the governorship of Utah. President Pierce and his immediate supporters talk loudly of their determination to put down traitors and all who defy the laws. But in Utah, the laws and authority of the United States, the legality and validity of which are not disputed throughout the Union, are openly defied. Brigham Young's term of service expired nearly 4 years ago. Pierce promised to remove him. So much for the promise. It turns out that the effort to execute the defied laws of the United States in Utah does not amount altogether to a tithe of that expended in securing the arrest and return of a single slave. In a sermon preached by Brigham Young on September 21st, I wish my own women to understand that what I am going to say is for them as well as others. I am going to give you from this time to the 6th of October next for reflection, that you may determine whether you wish to stay with your husband or not. And then I am going to set every woman at liberty. Sisters, I am not joking. I do know that there is no cessation to the everlasting whinings of many of the women of this territory. And if the women will turn from the commandments of God and continue to despise the order of heaven, I will pray that the curse of the Almighty may be close to their heels, and that it may be following them all the day long. And those that enter into it and are faithful, I will promise them that they shall be queens in heaven and rulers to all eternity. Prepare yourselves. You may go where you please after 2 weeks from tomorrow, but remember that I will not hear any more of this whining. My dear stranger friend, your kind note of inquiry was duly received. You asked me to give particulars in connection with the murder of Captain J.W. Gunnison. In the year of 1856, a favorite Indian warrior of Brigham Young, by the name of Aeneas, was put upon trial for the murder of Captain Gunnison and others. And at this time and upon this trial, I became convinced beyond the possibility of a doubt that the whole affair was a deep and maturely laid plan to murder the whole party of surveyors and charge the murder upon the Indians. It was proven by a number of Indian witnesses that only 4 shots were fired by the Indians, and that all the rest were fired by the Mormons, and that by order of the Mormons, the Indians sprang out of the ambush. And here, my dear friend, painful and revolting as it is, the true history of that sad scene requires me to say that several warriors crossed the Sevier River and proceeded to cut off the legs and arms of the men while in the agonies of death, and that Aeneas cut Captain Gunnison's body open and took out his heart while he was yet alive, and the heart so full of blood that it bounded on the ground after being taken out. And not content with this, they cut out his tongue and otherwise cut and mangled his body. True it is, my dear friend, that this dark, bloody picture will prostrate every nerve of your tender form. but duty to you, duty to the country, duty to a broken and violated law, duty to bleeding and downtrodden humanity, duty to a correct history in connection with the dark and bloody code of the high priesthood of the Utah Mormons, and above all, duty to the fair name and reputation of a brother officer engaged in the faithful discharge of his duty, and who fell in the noonday of life at the hands of an organized band of systematic pirates, robbers, and murderers, and whose blood yet cries to heaven for a witness to attest in thunder tones the dread but sad and solemn truth connected with his tragic fate, all seem to require that when I answer his wife, the companion of his youth, who so naturally applied to the man above all others possessed of the legal truths connected with this history, that I should tell them precisely as they are, and not suppress any part thereof. Your obedient servant, Judge W. W. Drummond. Arapane, the chief of the Pab Utah Indians, has been in the city recently. While here, he was very assiduous in endeavors to ascertain what the Mormons were going to fight the Americans for. He said they had been urging him to join them in such a war. Some suggest that Brigham is going on a tour among the northern Indians to excite them against the Gentile whites and induce them to join the Mormons in a war against the government forces, should any be sent out against them. A part of Mormon creed is baptism for the remission of sins, and this baptism is going on by the wholesale. I saw one party the other day of which over 400 were immersed. The shouts of merriment strongly reminded me of an old-fashioned sheep washing. As often as a man sins, he must be baptized with water or with blood. If a man's sins be very great in the eye of the church, his blood must atone for it. Active preparations are being made for a military expedition to Utah. The current opinion seems to be that a force of about 2,000 men is to be sent to that territory. The expedition, we infer, is not expected to take up the line of march from Fort Leavenworth until the middle of July, and then, as it will take at least 60 days to reach the neighborhood of Great Salt Lake City, it is well enough to consider what can be done before the winter sets in. The snows commence in that region in October, and unless peaceful occupation can at once be taken of Salt Lake City and quarters obtained for the troops, great privations and suffering may follow. An official notice from the Postmaster General says that the contract for carrying the mail to the Salt Lake has been set aside, and he has therefore ordered to withhold the mails until further notice. The mail contract was taken by a company of Mormons at Salt Lake City. So general were the complaints of the mails having been violated and letters opened, especially the correspondence of the government officials, that it became quite evident these Mormon contractors were mere tools of Brigham Young. I reached Great Salt Lake City without molestation, and immediately upon my arrival, I informed Governor Brigham Young that I desired an interview. He stated that the Mormons had been persecuted, murdered, and robbed in Missouri and Illinois, both by mob and state authorities, and that now the United States were about to pursue the same course, and that therefore he and the people of Utah had determined to resist all persecution at the commencement, and that the troops now on the march should not enter the Great Salt Lake Valley. Brigham, in a sharp letter on Indian Affairs, says, "Little has been effected in the southern county of this territory at the expense of the U.S. government, although much has been done by the saints in aiding the Indians with tools and instructions in cultivating the earth. I learned by report that many lives of immigrants and considerable property have been recently taken at Mountain Meadows. This is principally owing to a company of some 300 or 400 returning Californians who traveled these roads last spring to the eastern states, shooting at every Indian they could see, a practice utterly abhorrent to all good people. It is hard to make an Indian believe that the whites are their friends and that the Great Father wishes to do them good, when perhaps the very next party which crosses their path shoots them down like wolves." Brigham Young has assumed the powers of an independent sovereign and formally declared war against the United States. This outrageous conduct on the part of the Mormon leader puts him in the position of a rebel to the government and must bring his career to a speedy termination. With a history behind them, a history of nearly 30 years of trial and suffering, the Mormons of Salt Lake are now a nation rather than a religion. They are very strongly entrenched in their continental Palestine. Their riflemen won a reputation in the Mexican War which deserves consideration when we reflect upon their numbers. Mormonism in Utah is no longer a contemptible delusion. It has swelled from the proportions of a pitiful sect into those of an organized people. Mr. George Powers says on his arrival to the Utah Territory last August, "We remained in Salt Lake 5 days and then pushed on, hoping to overtake a larger train which had started 10 days ahead of us and which proved to be the train that was massacred at Mountain Meadows. We came to Buttermilk Fort and found the inhabitants greatly enraged at the train, declaring that they had abused the Mormon women, calling them whores. The people had refused to sell the train any provisions and told us they were sorry they had not killed them there, but they knew it would be done before they got in. They stated further that they were holding the Indians in check until the arrival of their chief, when he would follow the train and cut it to pieces." Governor Cummings has issued his proclamation. It announced that he has been appointed governor of the Utah Territory by President Buchanan and calls upon the people who have collected in armed bodies in opposition to the laws to disperse to their respective homes, stating that those parties who have been engaged in the lawless acts should be brought to punishment. Before the arrival of the U.S. troops at Fort Bridger, the Mormons laid the building in ruins and burned the grass on the plain, declaring that no U.S. troops should ever cross the mountains. We passed a full 15 miles into Echo Canyon before we came across any of the Mormon fortifications, consisting of loose stone laid up without mortar. The canyon here becomes narrower, the mountains rising to a great height on both sides. For the distance of a mile or more, and here and there, were piles of loose stone apparently designed to be hurled upon the heads of travelers along the road below. On the south of the canyon, ditches had been dug and breastworks thrown up at different heights, behind which hundreds of riflemen might be posted. We examined a number of these, and especially that which seemed to have been occupied by the commander-in-chief. It was evident that they had been deserted for some time past. The people are beginning to return to their homes, abandoned upon the approach of the army by order of their prophet and priest. The principal road, that to Provo, may be seen from the city for a distance of 25 miles, its whole length absolutely covered with the great family procession. It will take a month, however, at least, to get back again with their limited means of transportation, suggesting the utter folly of Mormon statements prior to the peace that they could move their households and 3 years of provisions faster than any army could follow. Thus is exploded another element of the stupendous game of Mormon brag, which frightened the President of the United States into the mistaken policy of obtruding an unasked pardon upon ungrateful traitors, rather than incur the responsibility of subduing them and so effectively curing their treason. In a letter from the Superintendent of Indian Affairs in Utah, I have just returned from a very laborious and difficult trip through the southern portions of this territory. I have succeeded in recovering 16 children and have them now in my possession. It is said that these are all that remain of probably 140 men, women, and children of the Mountain Meadow Massacre in September 1857. I was positively assured by the settlers in the neighborhood where I got the children that I have all that were saved. I have good reason for believing that none of these children have lived among the Indians at all. These children average from about 3 to 9.5 years old, are intelligent and good-looking, not one mean-looking child among them. The War Department has issued orders for the immediate withdrawal of all regular troops from Utah, about 500 in all, to aid in the war against the rebellious southern states. But the removal of this small force from Utah will prove a fatal blunder, as it will leave the great overland routes to California and Oregon unprotected and invite aggression both from lawless Mormons and hostile Indians. We have been blessed all winter with a number of Indians in our midst, who had their wickiups on the hills about the city. They have been principally Shoshones, or Snakes, of whom Washakie is the great chief, and generally very friendly disposed toward the whites. But they are moving now and preparing to quit the vicinity of the white man's homes for the hunting grounds in the mountains. The House concurred in the Senate's amendments to the House bill prohibiting polygamy in the territories of the United States and annulling the laws of Utah on that subject. The bill, now gone up to the White House, is a subject only for President Lincoln's action. Our Indian war at Bear River is over. Short, sharp, and decisive. Colonel Connor of the U.S. 2nd Cavalry may report, "I went, I fought, I conquered, I exterminated," for such indeed was the fact. It appears that the Indians were a mixture of Bannocks and Shoshones. The exact number of the slain is difficult to obtain. One man who claimed to have visited the battlefield after the strife said he counted 525 dead Indians. A dozen Indian warriors are supposed to have escaped, and those few fortunate fellows will tell their tale of blood. It may be that Colonel Connor's victory will prove a dear-bought one. There are some situations in which it is better to have the friendship than the enmity of even an Indian. The dullness of the times commercially is seen in various ways. There has been of late increasing complaints of burglary and petty robberies. This territory, however, is not a very flourishing one for gentlemen of the free and easy persuasion as to other people's property. A few nights ago, the shop of Sigmiller and Crow was broken into and a saddle appropriated by the intruder, who, however, was speedily stopped short by some swift messengers from a double-barreled shotgun. The unlucky night prowler was a young man of the name of Hurst, recently from the mines of Montana. He will never steal saddles anymore. There is underway a renewal of the movement for the admission of Utah into the Union as a state, the state of Deseret. The name Deseret, though rejected by Congress for the territory, is still tenaciously clung to by the people here, as it is held to be illustrative of industry, and not of the desert nature of much of the territory, as many people erroneously imagine. The newly proposed Constitution was amended so as to grant universal suffrage, striking out the words "free white." The territorial legislature also adopted a memorial to Congress for the appeal of the anti-polygamy law, which will no doubt be a source of amusement to the members of that body when it appears before them. This city and a large portion of this valley and some other valleys are now afflicted with the plague of grasshoppers. The air is full of them and has been for about 10 days. On the ground and on the trees and plants, they are thick as flies on a molasses plate, making the air vocal with their continual snap, snap, snap of alighting on the leaves of the plants and trees and the busy hum of their tireless wings. Most of the apple, pear, and plum trees are stripped of their foliage, some entirely, not a leaf left. Barley, wheat, and oats mostly are safe, being too near ripe to be injured, but corn, potatoes, beans, carrots, cabbage, etc. suffer greatly. This is about the sickliest season of the year in this locality, though this is not considered the most sickly year we have had by far. The mortality is chiefly among children. It is no easy matter to raise children in this place, however famous the country for the production of them. During the period of teething, the percentage of mortality is great, diarrhea, dysentery, canker, and consumption being the chief causes of death. The long-looked-for moment has arrived. The construction of the Pacific Railroad is en fait accompli. At 2:47 p.m., Promontory Point, Utah, gave the signal, "Done," and the continent was spanned with iron. A congratulatory dispatch from the Chamber of Commerce of New York stated, "The new highway, thus open to man, will not only develop the resources, extend the commerce, increase the power, exalt the dignity, and perpetuate the unity of our republic, but in its broader relations, as the segment of a world-embracing circle directly connecting the nations of Europe with those of Asia, will materially facilitate the enlightened and advancing civilization of our age." John D. Lee, the woman who is to be executed today for participating in the massacre at Mountain Meadows 20 years ago, has made a confession, and it amply confirms the popular belief in the complicity of Brigham Young in that horrible butchery. Lee says that shortly after the massacre, he went to Salt Lake City and made his report to Young, that he urged Young that those engaged in the slaughter must be sustained by the Mormon power, and that Young, after a pretended conference with the Almighty, assured him, Lee, that the deed was divinely approved. After this, Young, as president and prophet, visited the region near which the massacre took place and openly told his followers that the slain people had been justly put to death. Brigham Young died at 4 o'clock this afternoon. In appearance, he resembled much a New England farmer, as he originally was, a rather large figure, broad-shouldered, and stooping slightly when in a standing position. Hair light in color, somewhat narrow forehead, gray eyes, the lid of one drooping, fleshy cheeks, imperfect teeth, especially in the lower jaw, rather sharp-pointed nose, peaked chin, and generally somewhat irregular features. And yet, both his friends and enemies agree in saying that his appearance was agreeable and impressive. In conversation, he was pleasant and affable, unless rendered suspicious or encountering contradiction or opposition. Illiterate, yet not without talent, fluent in speech, and still without the first elements of the genius of an orator, he held his listeners easily, combining in his preaching a forcible pretension to heavenly revelation with a thorough knowledge of the subserviency of one part of his audience and the fervid superstition of the remainder. The very necessities of his religion, long after sincerity in its professions had left him, compelled him to analyze certain phases of human nature, and to these he alone appealed. But in his long government of the Mormon Church, not only things secular but things spiritual were ever rendered subordinate to the purposes of his own enrichment and self-aggrandizement. The prosperity of Utah was encouraged and fostered because it added to his vast accumulated wealth. The property of the Mormon Church was carefully tended and nurtured to the achievement of the same ends. Selfish, sensuous, and avaricious, Brigham Young could be and often was audaciously cruel, frequently betraying the spirit of a murderer, even if not following his brutal example. Gentiles who stay in the mining districts of Utah are now unmolested as a general thing, but those who endeavor to settle on arable land anywhere in the territory are never safe. The Mormons, no longer shooting down Gentiles openly in organized bands of Danites or murdering women and children as they did at Mountain Meadows, burn barns and other property of those settlers and drive them away. The Mormon incorporated cities cover almost all the arable land of the territory, for the Mormons fixed the limits with this end in view, so as to control all the land desirable for cultivation. John Taylor, the saint's new prophet, called 550 church members to settle the San Juan country of southeastern Utah to cultivate the goodwill of the Indians and to preserve law and order. In 83 wagons, driving more than 1,000 head of stock, they traveled about 200 miles through country where wagons had never been before. The most spectacular and dramatic place through which the colonists passed was a place 2.5 miles south of the confluence of the Escalante and Colorado rivers. There, they found a narrow hole in the canyon rim, which was enlarged by blasting to a width sufficient to permit the passage of a wagon. Through this, and over a steep slope, some parts approximately 45%, a road was built across slick rock and sand, and the wagons were driven over it. At other points, the workers constructed what they termed dugways, a rut dug so deep that a wagon wheel, once in the slot, cannot possibly get out. The extension of the Southern Utah Railroad has done much to bring remote parts of the territory into notice. Utah is unquestionably rich in minerals. Its gold, silver, coal, and salt mines give great wealth to the country, which the railroads are rapidly developing. In my travels through the territory on this and previous occasions, I found no cause to complain. Mormonism is a good deal as slavery seemed once to those of the North, who had never seen but only read one-sided, unreliable representations of it. Not half as bad when you come to see it. To the majority of the people of Utah, the 4th of July is a farce. When the sun rose yesterday, the national flag hung at half-mast on the City Hall and County Courthouse. The U.S. Marshal and 2 ex-Confederate soldiers demanded the flags be raised to full mast, which demand was met with denial. City officials said the 4th of July was a day of mourning to them and this people, whose best men were in the penitentiary by virtue of federal officials' perversion of all principles of law and liberty, and intimated that any man who undertook to disturb the flag at half-mast would be shot. The Supreme Court of the United States today rendered an opinion affirming the Edmunds anti-polygamy bill as being constitutional. The law, among other things, dissolved the Mormon Church Corporation, annulled its charter, directed the appointment of a receiver to wind up its affairs, and escheated to the United States all the real estate owned by the church in excess of $50,000, which was not held for the purpose of worship or burial. The court ruled that the act incorporating the church was invalid as an attempt to establish a religion contrary to the provisions of the Constitution. Utah was admitted to the Sisterhood of States at 10:08 this morning when President Cleveland signed the proclamation to that effect. There was no ceremony about the matter. Mr. Cleveland and Private Secretary Thurber were alone in the President's office at the time. The new state constitution shows many evidences of Mormon conservatism. One of the most important provisions bears their recent revelation and forever forbids polygamy. The great body of the Mormons are in earnest about polygamy and intend to keep faith with the nation. Tonight's estimate of the number killed in the terrible mine explosion here yesterday is 250, but the total death list may reach 300. Relief work is still in progress, being conducted by shifts of men. The shift now in the mine has 50 bodies ready to bring out, and the number of corpses to be reached is still uncertain. The financial loss to the company cannot be estimated yet, but it will be great. In every way, it is regarded as the worst disaster ever occurring in this part of the country. The mine is located near Schofield in Carbon County. Special agents of the federal government are reported to have been engaged for some time past in investigating public land frauds in Utah. Vast tracts of coal land are said to have been filed on and patented as agricultural and grazing land, and then transferred to coal companies. More than 2,000 of these coal entries have been made in the Salt Lake City Land Office, but not more than 1 in 50 of the persons who made the filings has completed the purchase. President Wilson, on recommendation of Secretary Lane, withdrew today 18,700 acres of public land in Utah for use of the Utah National Guard as a target range and maneuver grounds. The withdrawal was requested by the governor of Utah and was endorsed by the Secretary of War. Joe Hill, condemned murderer and agitator for the industrial workers of the world, will be put to death at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. Although protesting his innocence, Hill has refused to tell his whereabouts or to explain how he received the wound which led to his arrest, asserting that to do so would stain the good name of a leading Salt Lake City woman. Readying to die, Hill telegraphed IWW leader Big Bill Haywood, "Goodbye, Bill. I die like a true rebel. Don't waste time in mourning. Organize." Resolutions demanding a retrial or pardon for Hill have been adopted by hundreds of labor organizations. The governor's office received thousands of communications, many of them containing threats. Governor William Spry announced that he intends to clear Utah of all lawless elements and to stop incendiary street speaking, call it by free speech or any other name they wish. The Skull Valley settlement at Yosepa, a typical mile-square Mormon village of a couple of dozen homes, a chapel, and a school, has adjourned after 28 years of struggle. The 100-odd Hawaiian residents returned to their homeland when the Mormon Church recently completed a temple on the island of Oahu. The Hawaiians made a heroic effort to be pioneer Mormon farmers, but they never were a part of the society that tried half-heartedly to assimilate them. Unlike the Anglo-Americans who settled other valleys, the Hawaiians were not given plots of farmland and town lots in their own name. Yosepa was a plantation, and the laborers were paid $30 a month in goods for their labor. Early in its history, an outbreak of leprosy at Yosepa caused an explosion of hysteria in nearby Salt Lake City, but it was never really serious. 3 people got it, and all 3 died, and that was all. A campaign by federal and state authorities in Utah to rid that state of noxious animals resulted in the killing of 5,298 predatory animals with firearms and traps during 1919. However, these figures do not indicate the full extent of the work of the hunters, since they devoted a large part of their time to poisoning operations. The number of animals poisoned was estimated between 11,000 and 15,000. The task of exterminating predatory animals started 5 years ago, and it is estimated that there is an annual saving of 500,000 sheep from this work. Five men, chiseling in the hard sandstone of Split Mountain in Utah, have laid down their tools and brought to an end their long and tedious search for the skeletons of dinosaurs. And to this little group, led by Dr. Earl Douglas, science is indebted for the remains of 8 to 10 of the most astounding creatures the world has known. 23 million years ago, or thereabout, Utah was not the dry or mountainous country it now is, but was a low plain near sea level. The vegetation was practically tropical, with ferns and softwood trees predominating, and it is assumed that these were the foods of the herbivorous dinosaurs which inhabited this rather small part of the total continent. Contrary to the expectations of agricultural experts, a Utah man has succeeded in growing 2 different grains found deeply covered in caves once inhabited by members of the vanished race of cliff dwellers. The tallest stalks grown from this ancient corn have reached a height of more than 7 feet. Scientists are at variance in designating the number of years elapsed since the last ancients of this region perished. The period is given between 900 and 1,200 years. Fellow convicts went to the aid of Delbert Green today in his fight to escape a Utah firing squad after conviction for 3 murders and the death sentence. A smuggled petition, signed secretly by 268 of the Utah State Prison's 322 convicts, was presented to the Board of Pardons. The convicts contended the condemned man is of unsound mind. We respectfully submit, the petition read, that you should not permit a 10-year-old child to die before a rifle blast by the state of Utah. And so we humbly ask that you do not permit the same fate to befall a man whose mental condition places him in that category. A drive by the Latter-day Saints Church to take all its needy off the dole neared success tonight. By October 1st, Harold Lee, Church Security Director, said he expects none of the 80,000 indigent church members to be dependent upon government relief. They will either be given value received on work programs or will be cared for through the church's program of cooperative effort, he said. Teaching the poor to help themselves through canning, sewing, gardening, and industrial enterprises yields fine results in rehabilitation of the needy, Mr. Lee added. The Mormon Church has applied to the Federal Communications Commission for permission to construct a new international shortwave station at Salt Lake City at a cost of $250,000. The proposed station would be of sufficient power to reach any section of the world. No commercial programs will be broadcast. Engineers say the Bonneville Salt Flats offer the most perfect speedway and proving ground for automobiles in the whole world. The actual flats are a sheet of crusty salt, 20 miles long by 10 miles wide, shining like polished silver, so level that there is not the variation of a quarter of an inch in 9 miles. On this speedway, man has traveled faster than wheels have ever carried him before. It was here that Malcolm Campbell broke his own world record for the 5th time. In September 1935, he attained, for a measured mile, 301.1292 miles an hour. A strange new city has arisen in the past year and a half, the 5th largest in Utah, Topaz. It looks like a cross between an American military camp and Oriental town. The rows of regulation 100-foot-long barracks do not resemble soldiers' quarters because they sprout curtains, homemade awnings, and handkerchief-sized Japanese gardens. Inside, they are partitioned into rooms 20 by 24 feet to house 6 persons, and the rooms are often subdivided by curtains for the unlucky Japanese family that does not number 6 and has to share. Most of this relocation camp looks like an oasis in an endless desert of sand, sage, mesquite, and cacti. Federal and state authorities arrested today more than 50 persons in raids in Utah in a move which was said designed to stamp out polygamy. Arrests were made on complaints charging unlawful cohabitation and conspiracy to advocate, promote, encourage, urge, teach, counsel, advise, and practice polygamous or plural marriage. 12 persons were named jointly in an indictment charging conspiracy to use the males to circulate the pamphlet Truth, which the indictment said appealed to natural sexual instinct and appetites for unlawful and immoral indulgences under a cloak of religious sanctity and approbation. The United States Army took over the Bingham and Garfield Railroad today and appealed to striking trainmen to return to their jobs. The seizure, 12 hours after the strike started, was in accordance with a directive by President Roosevelt. It had been estimated that the strike, if continued, would halt production at the Utah Copper Company, producer of about 30% of domestic war-needed copper. The railroad is a subsidiary of the company. More than 400 dogs in Utah are helping humans find out what radioactive elements are potentially harmful. The dogs are injected with graduated doses of radium, mesothorium, plutonium, and radiothorium, all highly radioactive, and then observed closely. After 5 years of experimenting, the scientists are able to predict how much radioactive material will be discharged by the dog at a given time, when tumors will develop, and the long-range toxic effects of certain types of radioactivity. The Senate Interior Committee approved a bill today to authorize the allocation of 50,000 acres of public lands in Utah to the Navajo Indians. The land would be in exchange for an equal area of adjacent reservation lands that would be flooded when the Glen Canyon Dam is completed. The dam is expected to generate 900,000 kilowatts of electricity and will form a 186-mile-long reservoir on the Colorado and San Juan rivers. White and delicate, the seagull lily seems doomed to extinction in Utah. Urban spread and an oversupply of water is causing the decline. A xerophyte, the seagull lily flourishes in areas of limited water supply. The early Mormon pioneers survived hard winters by grinding and eating dried seagull bulbs. The seagull lily is Utah's state flower. Question. President Kennedy, scientists have announced that Utah children under 2 years have received from 2 to 28 times as much radioactive iodine-131 last year in less than a month as our government says is safe in an entire year. Does the government have plans to examine some of these children to detect possible damage? Answer. Well, as you know, the report is not unanimous. There's some controversy about it. And in addition, the standards that were set do not. I don't think we should mislead the people there that there is evidence on hand of a serious deterioration there. I would say that, as of now, that we do not believe that the health of the children involved has been affected. But it does tell us, though of course these matters require further study, what it does tell us is it's very desirable to get a test ban. The Central Intelligence Agency has confirmed that it canceled job recruitment on the University of Utah campus today because of a threatened demonstration by a student protest group. The student organization, the so-called April Committee, said it opposed recruitment of students by any group unwilling to explain its goals to the public. The CIA recruits heavily in Utah. Physicists are measuring the rain of high-energy particles called muons, a byproduct of cosmic rays that constantly strike the Earth from the sky, with giant detectors built inside Utah's Wasatch Mountains. Such rays are actually particles, some of which carry more speed and energy than any fragments of matter observed elsewhere in nature. The muons reaching the detectors in the cavern must go through some 2,000 feet of rock, thus only those with high energy, with more than 1,000 billion electron volts, survive. This is far more than the 70 billion achieved in man-made atom smashers. The head of a special investigating team said today that we are as positive as medical science can ever be that nerve gas tests conducted by the Army's top-secret Dugway Proving Grounds had killed the 6,400 sheep in Utah's Skull Valley. Senator Frank Mose was told that 320 gallons of a persistent nerve gas agent was sprayed from an airplane. A compound isolated in snow, water, sheep blood, sheep liver tissue, and in the grass taken from sheep's stomachs is identical to that agent applied by the Army. Replying to the charge, an Army spokesman said that a separate military investigation was continuing and that no definite cause of death had been established. Meanwhile, Dr. Kelly Gubler of the Tooele Valley Hospital has written in the Medical World News that the testing at Dugway could result in a massive human disaster. Robert Smithson's grandest work was the Spiral Jetty, a vast spiral of raw rock extending into the water at a remote location in the Great Salt Lake, executed in 1970. The work set forth his obsessive fascination with time, place, geology, and what he was pleased to call entropy. an elusive concept bearing on the extinction of matter and energy that had for his mind an almost mystical attraction. Eight years ago, in the middle of the desert, Melvin Dumar picked up a scruffy, bleeding man who said he was Howard Hughes. Mr. Dumar thought he was a bum. Today, a will purporting to be that of Mr. Hughes left 1/16 of the billionaire's estate, or about $100 million, to Mr. Dumar, a service station operator in Willard. The will appeared mysteriously 2 days ago on a desk at Mormon Church headquarters. The church was also named in the will for a similar amount. The 10-year suspension of capital punishment in the United States ended today when 4 .30-caliber bullets ripped through the chest of Gary Mark Gilmore, the convicted killer who had asked the state of Utah to execute him. "Let's do it," he said firmly when asked by Warden Samuel Smith if he had any last words. A signal was then given, and marksmen hidden behind an enclosed cubicle 30 feet away fired at the prisoner, who was bathed in light. An autopsy disclosed that all 4 bullets from the 5 firing rifles, one was loaded with a blank, had pierced Mr. Gilmore's heart. The dead man's eyes were removed for a cornea implant. The major organs, including the brain, were removed for medical study. Polygamy appears to be on the increase again in Utah. Most polygamists lead quiet lives and are shy of publicity. But attention has been forced on their growing number because of the indictment of Ervil LeBaron and members of his polygamous sect, the Church of the Lamb of God. Law enforcement officials believe the sect has been responsible for the murder or disappearance of at least 9 persons. Mr. LeBaron believes, according to his writings, that he has been anointed to run the world and that he has the right to execute anyone who disagrees with him. The 148-year-old policy of excluding black men from the Mormon priesthood based on spiritual inferiority was struck down by church leaders yesterday. Spencer W. Kimball, president of the 4.2 million members of the Worldwide Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, made the declaration. "It was a result of a revelation," he said. "He has heard our prayers and has confirmed that the long-promised day has come. Accordingly, now all worthy male members of the church may be ordained to the priesthood without regard for race or color." John Singer, the Utah polygamist who vowed he would never be taken alive in his battle to keep his children out of school, was killed by a shotgun blast today. Officers riding snowmobiles swooped down on Mr. Singer as he walked to his mailbox a quarter of a mile from his farmhouse in Marion. Singer had for several months faced an arrest order for contempt of court for keeping his children out of school. He maintained public schools would expose the children to sex, drugs, and textbooks teaching racial equality, contrary to his beliefs. Sonia Johnson, a supporter of the proposed federal Equal Rights Amendment, who was excommunicated by the Mormon Church, said today that the church's opposition to the amendment was motivated by its own business interests. "The Mormon Church is one of the 20 wealthiest corporations in the United States," Mrs. Johnson said. "The church owns many business interests that employ women at discriminatory wage scales, and thus has a financial interest in defeat of the amendment." A church spokesman said that if some church-owned businesses paid women less, "I'm sure those inequalities are gradually being taken care of." In southern Utah, members of the John Birch Society have decided that the national census is another example of federal control. One woman member proudly called the census office to announce that she had got 150 of her neighbors together and they had all burned their census forms. Census taker Carla Bergeson said she did not want to threaten to use the law against people who failed to fill out their forms. She said she planned to meet the Birch Group armed with a copy of an open letter from the president of the Mormon Church urging members to cooperate. Most of these Birch people are also church members, so I think it will be persuasive, she added. President Reagan appeared to have scored a major political victory in the West today, as officials in the region reacted with enthusiasm to his decision to scrap a plan to base MX missiles in the Great Basin of Utah. Instead, the missiles would be scattered in existing silos in Kansas and Nebraska. Although Mr. Reagan insisted that tactical considerations accounted for the decision, there were important political factors as well. A statement issued last May by the Mormon Church had a profound impact. It said that church pioneers had chosen Utah as a base from which to carry the gospel of peace to the peoples of the earth, and that basing the MX there would be a denial of the very essence of that gospel. For the first time in history, surgeons early today implanted a permanent artificial heart to replace a dying human heart. The operation, which lasted 7 hours, was performed at the University of Utah Medical Center by a team headed by Dr. William DeVries. The patient was Dr. Barney Clark, a 61-year-old retired dentist who, upon recovery, is destined to spend the rest of his life tethered to 6-foot-long hoses connected to an air compressor that powers the artificial heart. Jacqueline Sanders' earliest memories of nuclear fusion were of the way her family would watch from her front porch in St. George the unnatural fireball lighting the western sky. She was 5 years old when the first bomb, codenamed Abby, went off on January 27, 1951, and 12 when the last one, Titania, erupted on October 30, 1958. In between, the government blew up the equivalent of more than 1 million tons of dynamite in 103 atmospheric tests. In 1967, Mrs. Sanders, then 21, was diagnosed as having cancer of the thyroid. On Thursday, a federal district judge ruled that Mrs. Sanders' cancer and those of 10 other victims of the disease were caused by radioactive fallout, and that the government should have done a better job of protecting the people here. A new list of the potentially dangerous toxic waste sites was released today by the Environmental Protection Agency. The 2 sites with the highest priority for cleanup are both in Utah. They are a Sharon Steel Company smelter in Midvale and a Portland cement kiln in Salt Lake City. The agency has estimated that there may be as many as 22,000 toxic waste sites throughout the country that will eventually require cleanup. The Mormon Church's leading authorities, the Council of the 12 Apostles, chose Ezra Taft Benson at the age of 86, their new president. Mr. Benson stepped into the national spotlight in 1953 as Secretary of Agriculture to President Eisenhower, a position he held for 8 years. Later, his attack on the civil rights movement, on détente with Moscow, and on the women's movement occasionally embarrassed the church. In the 1960s, Mr. Benson became closely associated with, but never joined, the John Birch Society, a rightist political organization that his son Reed eventually served as press officer. For years, many residents of this predominantly Mormon state believed there was no AIDS problem, in line with the church's conservative sexual teaching. More than 65% of Utah's 1.6 million residents are Mormons, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a fast-growing religious organization whose doctrines rank homosexuality, adultery, and fornication next to murder and grievousness among major sins. Church members who become identified as homosexuals are directed by the church to marry, and they face excommunication if they do not cease homosexual contacts. Despite the vigorous moral climate, however, Utah has not been spared a problem with AIDS. In the past 3 years, 47 Utahns have been diagnosed as having AIDS, and 24 of the victims have died. Spurning his father's appeal that he submit to execution to atone for 2 murders, a former Mormon missionary chose instead today to plead guilty to the crimes in return for a sentence of life imprisonment. Mark Hoffman pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder as well as to forging documents about Mormon history. According to family members, the plea arrangement that spared his life was delayed in recent weeks by the intervention of his father, also a Mormon, and other family members who said they believed that if the younger Mr. Hoffman was guilty of the murders, he should be executed. This belief is rooted in the Mormon doctrine of blood atonement, which holds that some crimes are so grievous that the crucifixion of Jesus had not redeemed their sins. A senior official of the Mormon Church accused the press last week of Mormon bashing and distortions in its coverage of a difficult chapter in recent church history, the church's dealings with a forger of historic documents who killed 2 people in 1985 to conceal his crimes. Apostle Dallin Oaks, a member of the Council of 12, cited the New York Times for some of the most sustained and intense Latter-day Saints church bashing since the turn of the century. Mark Hoffman, the 32-year-old document dealer, is serving 5 years to life in prison. Some Hoffman documents tended to support Mormon doctrine claims of divine origin. A fire today destroyed part of the Morton Thiokol plant in Utah, where the first stage of the MX missile is built, killing 4 workers and threatening to slow production of the Air Force's most powerful nuclear weapon. In the last 4 years, Morton Thiokol's plant has been the scene of at least 4 fires involving rocket propellants. Congress says the Army is not providing adequate religious facilities for workers at Dugway Proving Grounds, where Mormon church officials were denied land to build a church. There are more than 700 Mormons at Dugway, an isolated weapon testing facility in the desert about 90 miles west of Salt Lake City. A burst of gunfire ended a 13-day standoff between a polygamist clan and the police. An officer, Fred House, was killed, and the group's leader, Adam Swap, was seriously wounded. None of the 9 children in the compound were injured. The siege began early January 16th, a few hours after the Mormon church in Marion, half a mile from the compound, was bombed. The police talked by telephone with Mr. Swap, who said the bombing had been an act of revenge against the church and the state for the killing by the police in 1979 of the polygamist clan's patriarch, John Singer. A response earlier to a letter from the governor that pleaded with the clan to surrender declared the ranch and people an independent and free nation and warned they would use any means to defend it. The Utah Textbook Commission has rejected an Indian request that grade schools remove a book containing stories of Washington Irving and John Smith that depict Indians as bloodthirsty savages. The Army has changed the plan for a new laboratory at Dugway Proving Ground. It will still build a laboratory there for testing defenses against biological weapons, but the safety features now being considered would preclude tests using genetically altered microbes or lethal diseases for which there are no cures. Ogden Police Chief Joe Ritchie says he hasn't let up on gathering information about Aryan Nation, the white supremacist group that planned to put a regional headquarters there. Also, Wendover Police Chief June Carter, Utah's only black police chief, says that his department knows of several white supremacists in the Wendover area. We had a deal where this one was watching us and our activities. He'd park across the street and listen to us with a special device, Chief Carter said. The Mormon Church has excommunicated the only American Indian who ever achieved a leading position in its hierarchy. The excommunication of the church official, Elder George Lee, a Navajo, was announced Friday. In an hour-long meeting with Ezra Taft Benson, the 90-year-old president of the church, Mr. Lee accused fellow churchmen of encouraging an attitude of superior race, white supremacy, racist attitude, pride, arrogance, love of power, and no sense of obligation to the poor, needy, and afflicted. The Air Force wants to create a $3 billion electronic battlefield to test aircraft and weapons under simulated combat conditions. The testing area would cover 1,400 square miles of Utah's western desert. Marysvale is becoming a ghost town, inhabited by widows and aging men who live with one lung and the daily worry of developing cancer in the other. The men were exposed to hazardous levels of radiation while mining uranium for the nuclear weapons industry from 1947 until the early 1960s. The Public Health Service predicted as early as 1949 that radioactive gas and dust in the mines at levels far in excess of federal safety standards would cause an epidemic of lung cancer unless conditions were improved. Attempts to improve conditions failed because of the willingness of the Public Health Service to abide by the Atomic Energy Commission's demand for secrecy. The health specialists did not tell the miners of the dangers or why they were undergoing periodic physical exams, chest x-rays, and blood, urine, and sputum analyses. The miners were being used as guinea pigs, and we were essentially watching them die, said Dr. Victor Archer, the principal investigator for the study. Today, most of the Navajos of southeastern Utah live without water or electricity on a reservation shot through with oil and gas exploration. They say the drilling has poisoned their wells, made them sick, killed their livestock and crops. The county, run by hard-nosed Mormon Republicans, shortchanges the reservation on services. Until 1956, Navajos weren't even allowed to vote, Utah being the last state to enfranchise natives. The governor of Utah signed into law yesterday the toughest anti-abortion measure in the 50 states after it sped through both houses of the legislature in 3 days. The law permits abortions only in cases of rape or incest, where the pregnancy threatened grave damage to the pregnant woman's medical health or to prevent the birth of a child with grave defects. A trainload of 2,400 tons of contaminated soil, rejected by landfills in at least 3 states, is on its way to Utah for disposal. The soil was excavated in Michigan from the site of a train derailment and contains acrylic acid. The only site in Utah licensed to take such material is a landfill near Tooele, operated by the United States Pollution Control Incorporated. Tooele, with 25,000 residents, is also the site of an Army chemical weapons dump. The startling assertion by 2 chemists that they had achieved nuclear fusion in a test tube was based on invented data whose publication involved a serious breach of ethics and a violation of scientific protocol, prominent scientists have concluded. The 2 researchers dismissed the charge, saying that their work was ethically sound and beyond reproach. The cold fusion debate erupted 2 years ago when the chemists, Dr. Stanley Pons and Dr. Martin Fleischman, announced at the University of Utah that they had captured the secret of the sun's energy at room temperature. The Utah Supreme Court tacitly acknowledged the practice of polygamy as an alternative way of life entitled to at least some legal protection. While the court affirmed the Utah Constitution's ban on polygamy, it ruled Tuesday that a family could not be automatically prohibited from adopting children simply because it is openly polygamist. The ruling was a victory for Vaughn Fisher and his 2 wives, who are seeking to adopt the 6 children of Brenda Johansson Thornton. She married Mr. Fisher in 1987, becoming his 3rd wife, but died 2 months later. The Pentagon has proposed to spend $200 billion in the next 30 years to prevent the spread of poisons and clean up its contaminated bases and munitions factories. The Army has proposed burning all its mustard gas and nerve agents, 70 million pounds of the world's deadliest chemicals. Most of the chemicals are 30 years or older and have become obsolete because age has caused the chemicals to deteriorate and because the necessary guns and launching platforms no longer exist. In Utah, citizens have overwhelmingly supported the proposal. Not surprisingly, the Army's first $250 million full-scale incinerator is under construction at Tooele. The title of the world's largest organism no longer belongs to the giant fungus under the ground in northern Michigan. An even larger organism has been identified in the Wasatch Mountains of Utah. It's a huge stand of 47,000 aspen trees and stems growing from a single root system that covers 106 acres, is genetically uniform, and acts as a single organism. When the trees change color in the fall, they do so in unison.